an episode. It is another episode of this show. There's been more than one. This is Don't Believe Jack. I am your host, Jack Michelle. I'm here. I'm chilling, having a good old time, eating some very good. I don't know what this dish is. It's not a biryani, but it's tasty. It's some. I mean, I I don't. Man, it's delicious, is what it is, and I don't know if. No, it's not a biryani. It's a. But it's also just not. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just a standard curry. Standard Stefan curry. I don't know why his name is Stefan. Stefan Hawking, man, it really sucked when he died. Uh, he was so good on the court. Steph, it's like when you have the same name but it's pronounced different ways. Someone pointed out to me. I keep making fun of Pete. I'm always like Pete. What's his name? And someone said that's rich coming from a guy with your last name. And I was like, that's a good point. Maybe I should be a little bit more tolerant. Buttigieg. I think that his name, the pronunciation of his name is going to be a bigger obstacle than his sexual orientation. That's all. It's his biggest obstacle is actually his name. It might, in the scheme of things, Barack Hussein Obama is like an 8 in terms of name rankings, and he's like a 10, maybe an 11. It seems hard. It just seems hard to pronounce his name. He that good old Buttigieg. Will say that he will probably be mopping the floor with like everyone in the debates based on what I've heard. He has a ton of good old appeal. He's got that sweet, sweet Obama juice just trickling out of him. Um, and I think that's hey, that more power to him. I do think it is interesting that I was talking about this yesterday with someone, and it was just the idea that like as a pretty much like lifelong Democrat, it's interesting because like if you really think about it, like the Democrats haven't produced the Democratic Party, like in other words, working your way up the ranks, hasn't produced a presidential candidate um, in forever, literally for like I mean, right? It's pointed out that Clinton was a governor, so he wasn't in Washington. Obama was there like '04 as a senator, and then '08 he's president. Like he's not. People aren't there for that long, and also like in terms of people working their way up through the system and like gathering power. It doesn't. It just doesn't seem to produce candidates that people actually like. I mean, people really didn't like Al Gore. People didn't like John Kerry. People didn't like Hillary Clinton, and they're all more like establishment figures. Not this isn't to make it into like some political podcast because there are certainly those, um, but I'm just saying like it doesn't like if you really think about it, like it really is true. It's like Obama's now in the posterity of the Democratic Party, but like he's never really like been in the Democratic Party. Like he was always just sort of an outsider and an outlier, right? I mean, like even when he was coming up, we all lived through that moment, and I remember everyone was like, no Democrats were actually siding with this guy. Uh, and then he started winning all these primaries, and then people were like, oh, I guess he's the dude. And I think that there is something to that. That like maybe it was interesting because this guy was just making the point that maybe Biden has that problem, right? Like he hasn't had to run for anything, like really like a truly open seat. In terms of being hungry, in terms of being like innovative, in terms of how he connects with people. He hasn't really had to like face anything like that. And this was a guy who I was talking with this dude who he loves Biden. He thinks Biden's great, but he's just like I don't. But like he might be just out of touch, and he doesn't really. He's not tapped into the reality of campaigning, and that's going to be shown very quickly. Which I think is like a really. I didn't think about that, but that's like a really really great point. That like it's these hungry candidates that are coming off of running. They don't have a bunch of like infrastructure around them. they're hungry, they're innovative. You know, it's almost like thinking about it. I know I'm talking almost like I'm talking in business terms, but I sort of am. And actually, I'm going to get to that later. That I've thought about something, but yeah, I mean, like, yeah, you have to have like this hungry sort of outsider, and I hate that term outsider insider because I feel like it's mostly used in sort of as like an epithet, but I mean it literally in the sense of like what are the qualities of maybe like an insider. It's like insider like knows a bunch of people and they sort of like know how to work the machine, and maybe like an outsider really doesn't know how to do that, and they rely on something else to proceed and advance. And yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about the fact that like if you think about like oh, and the reality that like maybe you know if you look at like um, Joe Biden, like he won his Senate seat in like the 80s, right? And you know he basically was just in the Senate as like a guy who was beloved in Delaware, um, and and then like he became like vice president. Like he hasn't had to like run for anything like in a seriously open, competitive, cut your throat kind of race in decades, and and that may start to show. Um, like Democrats can't get ahead with like elder statesmen, and for that matter, nor can Republicans. No one wants like the elder statesperson anymore. It's just people are not feeling it, and there's a kind of interesting reality to that. Uh, yeah, I don't know. So I just think that that is interesting. What I really want to talk about that I thought was like super duper interesting was like I've been talking with everyone has been joking and complaining about how many people are like running for the Democratic nomination, and then like in terms of when like the Clinton thing happened, when 2016 happened between like Bernie and Clinton in the primary, like there's this question of like is the party strong, is the party weak, or right, the idea that like after Obama's presidency, like the Democrats got like pummeled in a lot of races, both not only just like in national elect like in state elections for national positions and national elections, but also like in state houses. And the idea that like the Democratic Party is not strong, is sort of diluted, and I actually think it's interesting because I think like well I'll just say this, like there are so many people running for the Democratic presidency, and that if you think about it, like there are also like a ton of people who ran in 2016 on the Republican side, right? There were like 17 candidates, and like on the Democratic side maybe there were like 20 plus, and people are like this is crazy, but I was thinking about it, maybe again this is part of my pilgrimage to economics, uh, but it actually makes sense if you look at it from like a business perspective. Like it's not, and this is armchair, so feel free to dismiss it, but like essentially uh, what happened, like I guess what I'm trying to say is if you look at it, like there's so much more like upside. Think about it like if you think about it like a business, right? Like if you're being a presidential candidate is a business. The revenue went way up, and the operational costs, the costs of being a presidential candidate went way down. Um, there are so many more like channels where you can get coverage. Like okay, so let's talk about like the quote unquote revenue side. It's a lot easier to like just think about like now 2019, and then think about I don't know, think about 1989. So 30 years, God, 30 years. So think about 30 years ago and now, uh, and just compare the two. Like in terms of if we look at it like from a revenue perspective, there are a lot more ways to make money individually as a candidate. If you like, first of all, it's easier to fundraise. You used to have to hire like political consultants who would like send out a bunch of mailers, and you'd have to solicit donations in person, and then you'd have to have like some kind of infrastructure to capture all that money and log who donated it. Um, you had to find ways to solicit to people. Sending things in the mail costs a lot of like money. That's not revenue. Uh, that's on the cost side. But I'm sort of getting scrambled up. Okay, so basically, yeah, on the revenue side, there are just so many more ways to make money as a presidential candidate. I mean, first of all, it's um, there's a lot more small money donors out there, so that's a revenue stream. And then also, if you lose, right, like what's the downside of losing a presidential? Losing, you get labeled as a loser if you lose in the general election if you're the party's nominee. But like if you lose in the primary, uh, it's fine. Uh, it seems like it's perfect. Like no one, there's no punishment for it. And in fact, like it's really good. Like you can spin losing into a bunch of book deals, speaking engagements. Cable news didn't exist in the 80s. Now it's a very fertile field of going from show to show and conference to conference. Think about there in LA. There's something literally called Politicon, and it's just a conference for people who are political junkies. Right? Those kinds of opportunities didn't exist in the 80s, at least not nearly on the scale that they do now. Right? It's like a band. You can go from festival to festival. You can go to Coachella, to South by Southwest, to Bonnaroo, to Sasquatch, to Boston Calling, to you can just jump from festival to festival all year, and that is a totally different business model than being like a touring like artist back in the day. I think I don't know. I mean, I guess I have to ask like musicians, but it seems like they're into it. Um, and I guess what I'm just trying to say is like if right, I've known this, I've thought about this for a while, right? Like Sarah Palin, like in 2008, she was like the vice presidential nominee on the ticket, and she spun that into like books, a TV show. Like her granddaughter's famous. Like when there's like issues in her daughter's like marriage, like it gets coverage on national news, right? Like, and especially on like all of the cable news channels. Like there are just so many more outlets for and eyeballs that want to enjoy and consume all of this stuff that's available about her. And I think that that's just like the revenue streams are just crazy now, right? Like someone was joking with me. I mean, this person from Atlanta, and she was just like, "Look, Stacey Abrams lost an election, and she is probably making a ton of money now." All right, I mean, she's like a consultant. She goes and speaks. I work part time on a political TV show. All the guests on there, right? Like they're all making a living off of this stuff, off of being commentators or being asked to speak at places. So like the revenue opportunities are like through the roof. And then if you think about it, like so then let's switch to looking at like the cost side of running this business. Which is the costs have gone way down. Like I said, like you send emails. Emails are free, right? Like you used to have to send like individual donation cards to people. You'd have to pay postage on that, presumably, or maybe they work out some kind of deal where they can pay low postage. But basically, like political mailing is very expensive. Robocalls are, I think, relatively cheap, as are obviously like sending emails and doing essentially the equivalent of like a GoFundMe page. Um, and on top of it, like the real brilliance of that is you don't even need like a political specialist, presumably, to like help you. I mean, maybe to design some of those emails, but like in a lot of ways, what a politician does is very similar to like what any person, any entrepreneur, like who's trying to build awareness online does. So you can basically use like Salesforce as like a backbone to your solicitations. It will collect all your database. Like essentially you might have to have had some database administrator collect and enter and type in all those names of all the people who donated to you. And then you needed like a server to put that on, right? Like if you have something like Salesforce or something like cloud-based, first of all, that's all priced into your use of Salesforce or some kind of cloud thing. When people make the donation, they type it directly into their phone. Um, the money goes directly to like an account through like Squarespace or Square, not Squarespace, Square or like PayPal, and it goes into some account. When they put in their billing and their mailing address and their billing address, right, that immediately goes into political candidates' a database and doesn't need to be typed in by anybody, and it just needs to be like maybe checked by a staffer. Um, and also, presumably, like, I mean, my understanding, I use Salesforce at one job once, but basically, right, like, it's also, you don't have to front a bunch of money. Like, if you did political mailers, or presumably if you hired someone to do your revenue collection database, you probably had to pay them a certain amount up front, and it was a salaried position. Uh, Whereas now, right, like I'm sure Salesforce obviously takes a cut. Like if you're Pete Buttigieg, like they take a cut of every person. Like, if Jack Michelle donates to Pete Buttigieg, I enter my information into a computer. It goes directly into his server, which is hosted by Salesforce, and Salesforce takes a cut. But instead of Pete Buttigieg having to like pay someone like 100 grand up front, Salesforce makes a deal with Pete Buttigieg and saying like, we'll just take 3% of every transaction, and that will cover our expenses. So you don't have to pay anything up front to collect donations, right? We just take cuts from your donations on the donations, which makes it like even easier to roll out and become a presidential candidate. You don't, it used to be that you'd have to fight to even get media coverage. Now there's so many media outlets, and again, cable news, like people are like dying to have you speak with them. It was probably really hard to get. I mean, think about it. They're only in 1989. Even Fox really didn't exist as a broadcasting network. So, like you have such a small. You have like three channels, and how much news do they have on them? Not that much. They have like the evening news, and those are pretty much your options. So you have to be a pretty big political candidate to get some coverage. But now there's like a bajillion outlets. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, like, you should have. It actually makes sense for us to have a bunch of candidates in the same way that, like, Netflix. Like, it's basically like over the top politicking, right? In the same way that, like, think about how many TV shows there are now. They're like what I think a couple of years ago, I think in 2012 they were saying that there were traditionally, and maybe in the 90s, there were like 200 shows in production in LA, and then um, uh, basically like when Netflix and now Hulu and all these people are getting in the game, there was like a projection that there was going to be. I think in 2015, 4 years ago, there were 400 shows in production in Los Angeles because you just have a lot more lanes, so they can just be filled with all that stuff. I think the same thing, basically like the Netflix of politicians happened, where they can just give you like something that's like targeted, and it just stands out. And it's not like more people became civic minded. I think the same amount of people are civic minded. I just think that there's a lower barrier. There's much lower barriers and much bigger upsides to running. I also think, like, in the long run, I think this makes parties weaker, period. Because it used to be that maybe you'd have to, like, you'd have to pay your dues, so some politician would co-sign on you. Look at like AOC. Like AOC couldn't happen. Like AOC couldn't happen 40 years ago. The closest thing I've read about for myself is like when John Kerry was elected to Congress. What was it, in the 70s? And like like basically a bunch of like young gun Congress people came up. But again, like who is gonna know about them? Who's gonna cover them? How are they gonna speak directly to the people? Like now, like AOC, I mean, she doesn't even need the Democratic Party in a way. Like it's sort of an afterthought for her. She can speak directly to people. I just read an article yesterday that I thought was really interesting. And again, it was about there's like a anti-abortion, there's like a there's like a anti-abortion, pro-life, whatever you want to call it, Democrat, and that person is being challenged by a progressive, pro-choice uh, like Democrat, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is basically siding with the incumbent because that's just their policy. And this challenger is complaining about it, and can go directly to the media about it. And even like AOC actually chimed in and said, you know what, like we don't. She basically told all her followers, like she's like, don't donate to the DCCC, donate directly to the candidates you believe in. Right? That was really hard to do back in the day. Now it's just as easy to donate directly to a candidate as it is to the DCCC. So yeah, I mean, these people are gonna these sort of centralizing authorities are gonna have less and less power. I mean, essentially, what happened. I know I already said that it's like the Netflixization of politics and political candidates, but I really mean that. Like, I don't watch Ozark, but you do, you know, like, and with Ozark doesn't need me to watch it. I think in like a similar way, I think the something that's like really interesting, right? Is yeah, I mean, you used to have a central party because you needed some way to get connected with big money donors, or to get people to arrange PR so you could be on something like Meet the Press. Whereas like now you could just like blow up overnight. It's like artists. It's like the post, like AOC is like Post Malone. You know, she just like blew up out of nowhere, and everyone was like, oh, now everyone's crazy about her, right? Like, so like if anything, like parties are gonna get weaker and weaker and weaker. Actually, I think I mean like I don't necessarily believe the people who are like we're gonna have a multi-party system. I don't think that that's gonna happen. I think there are too many incentives for people to build these giant coalitions. Also, I think people's ideological commitments still fall under some sort of umbrella. Certainly, if they're not their ideological commitments, they're cultural commitments. Um, so it's not like parties are going anywhere, but parties are going to get super weak, super duper weak, um, because I mean voters are going to be really powerful, but yeah, I mean like I think the future is we're only going to have quote unquote outsider candidates because there's actually no if you just like there's become less and less upside to being sort of connected and an insider in the traditional way. That's already been sort of borne itself out electorally, if you really think about it. Like the last quote unquote like insider who was president was like George H.W. It's the last dude. We sort of like the outsiders, and on top of it, like social media and the ability to donate directly to candidates is only going to accelerate that. So, anyways, I know it's like super nerdy, but I just think it's really interesting, and like I said, like I mean, shit, I should run for office because it's just like there's so much upside in terms of like coverage, uh, that you can't you're not gonna really get harmed. Um, so I don't know. Yeah, but it's just funny when you think about it like through the lens of like a business that I'm like, oh, this all makes sense. Uh, if I don't think about this in like sort of a moral way, which actually I realize is the wrong way to think about like a lot of these decisions. Um, what else did I want to say? I went to a really cool exhibit at the California African American Museum. It was pretty dope. I also had like these cool History Channel YouTube clips, which I didn't watch there, but we'll watch later. And just another reminder that like there's over the top for like everything. Everything you want can be provided by the over the top gods. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I was gonna say that like essentially like the Democratic Party, Republican Party are basically having the equivalent of like the Arab Spring. Like once like individual people had power and could communicate directly with the public, like right, like the what's his name's government just like fell apart in Egypt, and in a lot of places. Of course, chaos ensued afterwards, but that's sort of part of the game. Where basically what I'm just trying to say is like we're having our own Arab Spring in Los Angeles, and I hope you will join us and have fun with it. Uh, yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Okay, I will talk to you later. Bye.